As it's now the holiday season, I wanted to go ahead and do a reading of my favorite Christmas story from A Pageant of Old Scandinavia, translated by Henry Goddard Leach. It's from 1014 AD, from the Icelandic fable Grettissaga, and it's titled The Ghost of Glam. I hope you enjoy it. The saga of Grettir the Strong is included with the five great family sagas. Grettir is historical, but the bear's son adventures attached to him are folklore. After his outlawry, he preferred to live a hunted life in Iceland, doing good deeds and protected by friends, until he was finally slain on his island refuge. North in Iceland, among the mountains in Waterdale, lived a man named Thorhall. He was a rich farmer and had more sheep than anyone else in the valley, but he had this great trouble. His farm was haunted. Thorhall's farm was so much haunted that he could scarcely get a shepherd to stay out his time. He asked all his friends what to do to scare away the spirits, and he tried all sorts of advice, and nothing did any good. At last he heard about a big Swede named Glam, who had come to Iceland. People said Glam was a first-class shepherd and too strong and ugly to be afraid of ghosts. One day Thorhall was walking upon a mountain when he saw a man coming toward him out of the woods, carrying brushwood on a horse. They soon met, and Thorhall asked his name. He said he was called Glam. This man was very big indeed, strange and uncouth. His eyes were gray and glaring, and his hair gray like a wolf. Thorhall shivered when he saw him, and then he realized that this was the Swede. So he asked, "At what sort of work are you best?" Glam growled and said he was good at watching sheep in winter. "Then will you take care of mine next winter?" asked Thorhall. "On one condition," said Glam gruffly, "that I do very much as I please. I have an ugly temper if things don't suit me." "Well, I'm not afraid of that," replied Thorhall pleasantly. "I should like you to come to me." "I'll do so," Glam said. "But is anything wrong at your place?" "It is thought to be haunted," Thorhall admitted. At that Glam leaned back and laughed a horrible guffaw. "Ha ha! Such bugaboos won't scare me. They make life more lively." "You'll need to be brave," said Thorhall. "My farm is no place for a coward." After that they struck a bargain, and Glam was to come at the beginning of winter. Summer passed, and Thorhall heard nothing about his shepherd, but at the appointed time he came to Thorhallstead. Though the farmer received him well, the other farm folks could not endure him, and the good wife least of all. Glam took to tending the sheep. They gave him little trouble, for he had a big husky voice, and all the flock scrambled together as soon as he whooped. Glam was not a religious man. In Sweden, where he came from, the people were still heathen, and Iceland had been Christian only a few years. Though there was a church at Thorhallstead, Glam never went in. He hated the church service. He was also cross-grained and surly and hard to get on with. Now time went by until the day before Christmas. That morning Glam got up early and called for his breakfast. The farmer's wife replied, "It is not the custom for Christians to eat today, for tomorrow is Christmas, and today we ought to fast." He scowled and answered her in his surly way, "You have so many foolish fashions from which I see no good come, and I don't see that people are better off now than they were before when they paid no attention to such tomfoolery. I think things were better when we were all called heathens, and now I want my food and no fooling." Then the good wife said, "I know for sure you'll come to grief today, if you act in this way." Glam cursed and raged, bade her bring his food at once, and said that otherwise she'd be sorry for it. She was so frightened that she dared not refuse him. So he ate his breakfast, and then went out to his sheep, still cursing. The weather was bad that day, murky all over. Snowflakes fluttered down, there were loud noises in the sky, and it grew worse during the day. All the morning men heard Glam whooping for his sheep, off on the mountain. They heard less and less of him as the day passed. It snowed hard in the afternoon, and toward evening the storm was very heavy. Then people went to the church and came out about dark, and Glam had not come back. There was some talk of going to search for him, but nothing came of it, because of the snowstorm and the pitch darkness. All that night Glam did not come home. Next morning, Christmas morning, the storm stopped. Still men waited until after church. Then they went out on a search for him. They found his sheep scattered far and wide over the moors, or straight up on the mountains. After a long hunt they came to a great trampled place, high up in the valley, and it seemed as though there had been some terrible struggle, for rocks were torn up all around, and even clods of frozen earth. They looked about carefully and saw Glam lying a short distance off. He was dead, and as blue as hell and swollen up as big as an ox. It was so horrible to look at him that their very souls seemed to shudder. Yet they tried to carry the body to the church. It was so heavy they only got it to the edge of a cliff a little further down. There they left it, and went back to the farm and told Thorhall what had happened. He asked them what killed Glam. They said they had tracked steps as though a barrel bottom had been stamped down in the snow, leading from the trampled place up to the steep cliffs at the head of the valley, and all along the track there were huge bloodstains. Men drew from this that the evil spirit which lived there before had killed Glam, and then died of the wounds it received from him. For nothing has ever been seen of that demon since. The day after Christmas they tried again to carry Glam to church for burial. They yoked horses to him and tugged all day, but he was so heavy now that they could only move him down the hill, and not an inch on level ground. He had to be left there. The third day a priest went with them, but Glam's body could not be found, though they searched all day. Next day he refused to go again, and when the priest was not with them they found the body at once. But they stopped trying to bring Glam to church, and buried him on the spot to which he had been brought. A little time after, people became aware that Glam's dead body was not lying quiet. In fact, it seemed to be walking all over the valley. People who saw it said the body was twice as tall and big and ugly as when Glam was alive, all bloated and blue, with a hideous gleam in its eyes. Many people fell into a trance when they saw it, and some went mad. Just after Christmas week, men thought they saw it home at the farm and became terribly frightened, and many ran away. Next, the dead Glam took to riding on the roofs of the houses at night, and almost broke them in. Soon it was walking about in broad daylight. People hardly dared go into the valley of Waterdale to see Thorhall and the other farmers who lived there, and everyone in Waterdale thought things were in a bad way. In spring, Thorhall got new farm hands, and started farming again. The hauntings began to stop as the days grew longer, and so things went on till midsummer. That summer a ship from Norway landed on the firth north of the Thorhall stead, and on board was a man named Thorgout. He was a foreigner, big and muscular, with the strength of 2 ordinary men. He was unhired and unmarried and looking for a job. Thorhall rowed to the ship and found Thorgout, and asked if he would work for him. Thorgout said he'd be willing to do any sort of work. "But before you think of coming to me," said Thorhall, "you must know that my farm is no place for a coward, because of the hauntings which have been going on there for several years. I'll not persuade you to come by lying." Thorgout laughed. "I won't think all's over with me if I see a few ghosts. It'll be a very hard matter for other people, if I'm frightened. I'll not shirk my job on that account." So they struck a bargain on the spot, and Thorgout was to watch sheep in winter. Summer passed, and Thorgout started shepherding with the winter, and all the farm hands liked him. Then the dead Glam began coming again to the farmhouse and rode the roofs. Thorgout thought this great sport. He said the spook would have to come nearer before he would be afraid of it. Thorhall told him not to brag. "It will be better if you have no trial of each other." "Your courage has certainly been shaken out of you," said Thorgout, "but I'm not going to drop dead in broad daylight for such talk." So things went on till Christmas. The morning of Christmas Eve, Thorgout was starting out to his sheep, when the housewife said to him, "I hope that things will not go the old way." "Don't worry, good wife," said he. "There'll be something worth telling about if I do not come back." After that he went to his sheep. The weather was quite cold, and there was much snow. Thorgout usually came home when twilight set in. Today he did not return at that time. People went to church without him, and things began to look as they did the year before. The farmer wanted to search for his shepherd, but the churchgoers begged off, saying that they would not risk themselves in the hands of evil demons at night. Thorhall dared not go alone, and so no search was made. Christmas Day, after breakfast, the farm hands went out to look for Thorgout. They first walked to the cairn, the stone hut in which Glam was buried, because they thought he was somehow to blame for the shepherd's disappearance. When they came near the cairn, they saw something terrible had happened, for there they found the shepherd with his neck twisted round, and every bone in his body broken. They brought him to the church, and no harm came from Thorgout afterwards. Now Glam's body took to getting new strength. It did so much mischief at last that all the farm hands fled from Thorhallstead, leaving Thorhall and his wife and a cattleman. The cattleman had been with Thorhall many years, and was very old, and did not want to leave, for he saw that everything his master had would go to rack and ruin if there was no one to look after it. Now one morning after midwinter, Thorhall's wife went out to the barn to milk the cows. By this time it was broad daylight, for no one ventured outside earlier than that except the cattleman, who always went out at dawn. She heard a great cracking in the barn, and fearful bellowing, and ran back to the house again, crying out, and said she did not know what frightful things were going on in the cattle shed. Thorhall hurried out to the cows and found them goring each other. He thought he'd better not go in there, so he went to the hay barn, and looking into the cow shed, he saw the cattleman lying on his back, hanging over the stone partition between two stalls. He hung like a rag, with his feet dangling in one stall and his head in the other. The farmer went up to him and felt him all over, and found he was dead and his back broken. It had been broken over the stone barrier between the stalls. Now the farmer thought there was no living longer at Thorhallstead, so he fled away from his farm, taking what he could with him. But all the livestock which was left behind Glam killed, and then went down the valley of Waterdale and ruined half the farms. Thorhall stayed with friends the rest of the winter. Now no one could go up into Waterdale with a horse or a hound, for it was killed at once. But when spring came and the days grew longer, the ghost visits became less frequent, and Thorhall decided to return to his own land. Though he had no easy task in getting servants, still he opened his house again at Thorhallstead, and things went on the same way as before, for when autumn came the hauntings began again. Glam showed himself most often to the farmer's daughter, and terrified her more and more each time until at last she died of fright. Many plans were tried, all in vain, and it seemed as though all Waterdale would be laid waste if no remedy were found. About the time winter set in, a young man named Grettir Asmundsson came to visit his uncle, who lived on a farm at the other end of Waterdale. This Grettir was the strongest man in Iceland. When only 15, he killed a man, and was banished from Iceland for 3 years. He went to Norway, where he did many great deeds, and was just this year come back to Iceland at the age of 18. Grettir's uncle received him well, and he was there 3 nights. At that time people in Waterdale talked about nothing else so much as Glam's walkings, and Grettir asked closely about all that had happened at Thorhallstead. Grettir's uncle told him that every word was the truth. "But perhaps you are intending to go to Thorhallstead yourself, nephew?" Grettir said he was. "Don't think of such a thing," cried his uncle. "It's a dangerous venture. Your relatives don't care to lose you, for we think there is not another like you among the young men of Iceland, and bad will come from bad, as the proverb says, where Glam is. It is far better to deal with mortal men than with demons." Grettir said he would go to Thorhallstead and see what was happening now. "I see," his uncle replied. "It's no use to hold you back, but the old saying is true, that good luck and good heart do not always go together." Grettir answered him with another old proverb. "Sorrow stands before one's own door when it has entered a neighbor's house. Glam may come to your farm, uncle, if something is not done soon." "Maybe we both see the future," his uncle answered, "and yet neither of us can prevent it." After this they parted, and neither liked the other's forebodings. Grettir rode to Thorhallstead, and the farmer welcomed him. He asked where Grettir was going, and Grettir said that he would stay overnight if it were convenient for the farmer. Thorhall said he thanked him for staying, but few people think it a treat to be guests at my house for any time. You must have heard what is going on here, and I don't want to get you into any trouble on my account. Even if you yourself escape safe and sound, I'm certain you'll lose your horse, for no one who comes here can keep his horse uninjured. Grettir said there were plenty of horses, no matter what happened to this one. Then Thorhall was delighted that Grettir really wished to stay, and shook both his hands. The horse was locked up securely in an outhouse, and they went to sleep, and that night passed, and Glam did not come. Then said Thorhall, "Your coming here has done wonders, for every night Glam is in the habit of riding our roofs, or breaking open our doors, as you can see for yourself," and he pointed to the great doorway. The door had been splintered by Glam, and Thorhall had filled up its place with benches and planks and any heavy timber he could find. "Then one of 2 things will happen," said Grettir. "Either Glam will not hold back long, or the hauntings will stop for more than one night. I will stay here another night and see what happens." After this they went to Grettir's horse, and it had not been meddled with, so the farmer thought things looked brighter. Grettir stayed another night, and still the fiend did not come back. The farmer thought that a very hopeful sign. But this time, when he went out to feed Grettir's horse, he found the outhouse broken into, and the horse dragged out the door with every bone smashed. He told Grettir what had happened, and bade him save himself, "For your death is sure if you wait for Glam." Grettir answered, "I must be paid for my horse by at least one sight of that creature." The farmer said it was no fun to see him, for he is unlike anything in the shape of man, but I am thankful for every hour that you are willing to stay with us. The day went by, and when bedtime came, Grettir would not take off his clothes, but lay down on a bench against the farmer's bed-closet. He spread a thick cloak over himself, wrapping one end of it under his feet, and doubling the other under his head, while he looked out at the head opening. There was a heavy plank at the foot of the bench, and against this he braced his feet. The fittings of the outside door had all been broken by Glom on previous visits, and the heavy timbers set up instead were roughly fastened for the night. The paneling which had once stretched across the hall was all broken away, both above and below the crossbeam. The beds had all been pulled out of their places, and everything was upside down. A light was left burning in the hall through the night, and when a third of the night had passed, Grettir heard loud noises outside. Then something went up on the house and rode above the hall, and drove its heels into the roof so that every rafter creaked. This went on for some time, and then it came down from the roof and went down to the door. And as the door opened, Grettir saw the Death Walker thrust in his head. Frightfully big he seemed, and his features huge and coarse. Glom advanced slowly, and raised himself up when he came inside the door, till he towered up high toward the roof. Then he turned and looked down the hall, resting his arms on the crossbeam, and glared about. Thorhall kept silent in his closet and lay shivering. Grettir did not move a muscle. Glom saw the bundle lying on the bench, and thereupon stalked up the hall and gripped the cloak. Grettir braced his feet against the plank and did not budge. Glom tugged again, much harder. Still the cloak did not move. The third time he pulled with both hands so hard that he drew Grettir upright from the bench. The cloak tore in two between them. Glom stared at the piece he held, as though wondering who it could be, who had pulled so hard against him, and in that instant Grettir dove in under his hands and gripped him tight around the middle, and bent back his spine as far as he could, intending to make him fall backwards. But the monster pushed down on Grettir's arms so fiercely that he had to give way before Glom's strength. Then Grettir backed off to some benches fastened to the floor, but those overturned, and everything they stumbled on was broken. Glom wanted to get him outside, but Grettir braced himself against everything he could. Yet Glom dragged him to the hall door. There they had a fierce wrestling, because the Death Walker meant to bring him out of doors, while Grettir saw that bad as it was to fight with Glom in the house, it would be still worse outside. Therefore he struggled with all his might and main against leaving the hall. When they came to the outer door, the demon put forth all his strength, and hauled Grettir close up to him. And when Grettir saw he could not get a purchase in the doorway with his feet, he suddenly changed his plan, and threw himself with all his might against the creature's breast, pushing back with both feet against the half-sunken stone which served as a threshold. Glom was not ready for this, as he'd been dragging Grettir toward him, so he staggered backwards, crashing out through the door, and his shoulders caught against the beam over the doorway, and the roof burst in two, both rafters and frozen thatch, and he fell out of the house with his arms thrown out, and Grettir on top of him. Outside, broken clouds drifted over the moon. Just as Glom fell, a cloud was driven from the moon, and the Death Walker cast his eyes sharp against it, and Grettir himself says that of all the hideous things he ever saw, this alone frightened him. Then Grettir's heart sank so low from the weariness and from seeing Glom roll his eyes so hideously that he could not draw his sword, and lay just between earth and hell. For the first time, then, the Death Walker spoke. "Grettir, you've been very eager to meet me, but you'll get little good from our acquaintance. You are strong as it is, and you would have been stronger still if you'd never seen me. I lay this spell on you that everything shall go wrong with you after this. You shall be outlawed, and live a solitary life, and in the dark you shall always see these eyes of mine staring into your own, and find it hard to be alone, and that terror shall drag you to your death." When Glom's ghost had done speaking, Grettir's weakness left him immediately, and drawing his sword he hewed off Glom's head, and, as should be done with all those who walk after death, he laid the head against the creature's thigh. Then the farmer came out, having dressed while Glom was speaking his spells. He dared not come near until Glom had fallen. Thorhall praised God and thanked Grettir for having vanquished this unclean spirit. Then they burned Glom's body till the coals of his corpse were cold. After that they gathered his ashes into a sack and buried it where sheep were least likely to pasture, or men to tread. This done, they walked home, and it was now near daybreak. Grettir lay down, for he was very stiff, while Thorhall sent to the nearest farm for the men, and showed them, and told them what had taken place. All men thought highly of the adventure, and it was commonly said that for strength and daring and all kinds of deeds, there was none in Iceland like Grettir Asmundsson. Thorhall saw Grettir off handsomely, and gave him a good horse and a fine suit of clothes in place of those which had been torn to pieces. Then they parted, lifelong friends. But always afterwards Grettir said that he had become afraid in the dark, and that he dared not go anywhere alone after nightfall, for then he saw all kinds of horrors. This fear was at last the cause of Grettir's death, and it has been a saying in Iceland ever since, when people imagine things very different from what they are, that Glam gives them his eyes, or gives them Glam sight. Well, thank you all very much for listening. That was just a reading from Grettissaga, a thoroughly enjoyable little episode which has frequently been compared to the scene in Beowulf. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it, and Merry Christmas.